What happens when you start studying people? The moment you stop seeing people normally, there comes a moment in life when you stop looking at people the same way. At first, you don't notice it. You still smile. You still talk. You still go through conversations like everyone else. But something inside you has changed. You begin to watch, not just listen to what people say, but how they say it, the pauses, the hesitation, the smile that arrives half a second too late. The eyes that look away at the exact moment a question becomes uncomfortable, and suddenly you realize something disturbing. Most human interaction is not honest, it is performance. When you start studying people, you begin to see the hidden layer beneath every interaction. You notice that many conversations are not about truth, they are about position. People are constantly negotiating invisible hierarchies. Who has status? Who has approval? Who has emotional leverage? Who controls the narrative? And once you see this, you can never unsee it again. Carl Jung spent his life studying this exact phenomenon. He believed that every person wears a persona, a psychological mask, designed to help them survive socially. This mask is not necessarily evil. It is necessary, but it hides something deeper. Behind the persona lives something Jung called the shadow. The shadow is everything a person hides about themselves, their jealousy, their resentment, their insecurity, their hunger for power. And when you begin studying people, you begin seeing the shadow leaking through the mask. You notice the friend who compliments you too enthusiastically, but somehow their tone feels wrong. You notice the coworker who agrees with everything you say, but only when someone important is watching. You notice how some people change their entire personality, depending on who enters the room. This is not imagination. This is pattern recognition. Manipulators rely on the fact that most people never study behavior deeply enough to notice these patterns. They depend on distraction, on emotional reactions, on your willingness to believe the story instead of watching the behavior. But when you begin studying people, the story stops working, and the behavior becomes obvious. At first, this realization is exciting. You feel like you've discovered a hidden layer of reality, like you've unlocked a psychological code. You can suddenly read tension in a room before anyone speaks. You can sense dishonesty before the lie is even finished. You can see manipulation forming before it fully appears. This is why highly observant individuals often feel like they are watching a play that everyone else believes is real, because most people live inside the performance. But observers see the script, and this is where the first psychological shift happens. You stop reacting immediately. Instead, you watch. You watch the person who always redirects conversations when accountability appears. You watch the person who suddenly becomes vulnerable exactly when they need sympathy. You watch the person who introduces third parties to validate their position. These behaviors are not random. They are strategies. Some people redirect conversations to avoid blame. Others use emotional vulnerability as leverage. Others isolate you by referencing imaginary supporters. These tactics operate quietly inside everyday interactions. And once you start seeing them, human behavior becomes predictable. But here is the truth most people do not expect. Studying people does not immediately make life easier. At first, it makes it heavier, because you begin realizing something uncomfortable. Many relationships you believed were genuine were actually built on unconscious patterns: approval seeking, emotional dependence, manipulation disguised as affection, power disguised as kindness. And once you see these patterns, the illusion of normal social life begins to crack, because most people are not interacting with you. They are interacting with the role you play in their life. The helper, the listener, the emotional support, the agreeable friend. But when you start studying people, you start asking a dangerous question. Who would still be here if I stopped playing my role? And that question changes everything, because the moment you stop reacting automatically, you stop feeding the psychological dynamics that many people depend on. And when those dynamics disappear, some relationships disappear with them. But this is only the beginning, because once you begin studying people long enough, you start noticing something even more unsettling. Not just how people behave, but why they behave that way. And that realization changes how you see the entire human world. You start seeing motives instead of words. Once you begin studying people deeply enough, something fascinating happens. You stop listening to words, and you start listening to motives. Because words are cheap. Anyone can say the right sentence. Anyone can sound kind. Anyone can sound loyal. But motives always reveal themselves through patterns. You notice the coworker who praises you publicly, but subtly undermines you in private conversations. You notice the friend who only reaches out when they need something. You notice the person who apologizes quickly, but never changes the behavior that required the apology. These patterns expose something powerful. Human behavior is driven far more by psychological needs than by morality. People act from hidden motivations. The need for validation, the need for control, the fear of rejection, the desire for status. Once you begin studying people, you start recognizing these drivers behind almost every interaction. Someone isn't being generous. They're buying influence. Someone isn't being helpful. They're building obligation. Someone isn't being vulnerable. They're lowering your defenses. And here is where things become truly interesting. You begin noticing how predictable these patterns are. Manipulators rarely use obvious aggression. Instead, they rely on subtle psychological moves. They shift the conversation so you end up explaining yourself. They repeat the same accusation until it starts feeling believable. They introduce other people's opinions to isolate you. These tactics work because most people react emotionally instead of analyzing the structure of the interaction. But when you study people, you begin analyzing structure. For example, you realize that some arguments are never meant to be solved. They are meant to exhaust you. You realize that some compliments are not admiration, they are hooks. You realize that some kindness is not generosity. It is investment, expecting a return. At these days, your perception sharpens dramatically. You begin seeing what Jung described as projection. Projection happens when someone cannot face their own darkness, so they accuse others of it instead. Their insecurity becomes your fault. Their anger becomes your responsibility. Their jealousy becomes your supposed arrogance. Projection is one of the most common psychological defenses in human behavior. And once you learn to see it, arguments stop confusing you, because you realize something critical. Many conflicts are not about truth. They are about psychological displacement. When someone feels shame, they may accuse you of disrespect. When someone feels envy, they may accuse you of arrogance. When someone feels insecurity, they may accuse you of being insensitive. They are not describing you. They are revealing themselves. This is when the second major shift happens. You stop taking things personally, not because you are emotionally numb, but because you can see the psychological mechanics behind the interaction. You see the insecurity driving the insult, the fear driving the control, the desperation driving the manipulation. And strangely, this does not make you hate people. It makes you understand them. But that understanding comes with a cost, because the more you study people, the harder it becomes to participate in superficial relationships. Small talk starts feeling like theater. Forced politeness starts feeling exhausting, and many interactions begin to feel scripted. This is why people who deeply study human psychology often become quieter, not because they are antisocial, but because they no longer feel compelled to participate in every interaction. They observe. They listen. They wait. And that silence begins to make others uncomfortable, because most people expect immediate emotional reactions. Agreement, defense, justification. But when you stop reacting, the entire dynamic changes. And this leads to the third psychological shift. When you study people long enough, you stop trying to change them. You start deciding whether they belong in your life. You become quietly dangerous. There is a point in studying people where something inside you becomes very still. You no longer rush to defend yourself. You no longer explain every decision. You no longer try to convince others of your intentions. You simply observe, and this calm observation makes you quietly dangerous. Because manipulators depend on predictability. They need to know how you will react. Will you get defensive? Will you try to prove your innocence? Will you argue? Will you apologize? Each of these reactions gives them control of the interaction. But when someone stops reacting emotionally, the manipulator loses their map. Silence becomes one of the most powerful psychological defenses, not passive silence. Strategic silence. When someone tries to provoke you and you remain calm, the tension returns to them. When someone tries to bait you into defending yourself and you simply watch, the conversation collapses. Manipulation depends on emotional participation. Without it, the game stops working. This is why people who study human behavior deeply often appear intimidating. Not because they are aggressive, but because they are unpredictable. They cannot be easily manipulated. They notice subtle inconsistencies. They remember behavioral patterns. They refuse to explain themselves unnecessarily, and when necessary, they simply walk away. This is what Jung described as psychological individuation, the moment when a person stops living through social expectations and begins living through their authentic self. At this stage, your attention changes direction. You stop analyzing every conversation. You stop trying to understand every personality. You stop trying to fix every problem. Instead, you focus your energy carefully because you realize something most people never understand. Your attention is your most valuable resource. Every time you invest emotional energy into someone, you are strengthening a psychological bond. And if that bond is built on manipulation, you are feeding the very dynamic that harms you. But once you see this clearly, your behavior changes. You become selective. You invest your energy only in people who show consistency, integrity, reciprocity, and suddenly, your social world becomes much smaller, but much healthier. Because studying people eventually leads to one final realization. You cannot control human nature, but you can control your proximity to it. Some people will always manipulate. Some will always compete. Some will always pretend. That is part of human psychology. But your power lies in recognizing those patterns early and choosing where you place your attention. Because the most powerful observers are not the ones who expose everyone. They are the ones who simply step out of the game. They stop arguing. They stop explaining. They stop reacting. And in that quiet distance, they gain something most people never achieve: clarity. And once you see human nature clearly, you move through the world differently, not with suspicion, but with awareness. Not with anger, but with understanding. And that awareness becomes your greatest protection. The dark side of seeing too much. There is something most people never talk about when it comes to studying human behavior. Seeing clearly has a price. At first, learning psychology feels empowering. You start recognizing patterns. You understand manipulation. You see emotional dynamics that once confused you, but slowly, something else begins to happen. You start realizing how many interactions around you are not authentic. You notice how often people change personalities depending on the audience. You see someone speak kindly to a friend, then mock them when they leave the room. You watch someone pretend to care about a conversation, while secretly scanning the room for someone more useful to talk to. And you begin to realize something uncomfortable. Many social interactions are built on mutual illusions. People are not always connecting. Sometimes they are negotiating status. Sometimes they are managing appearances. Sometimes they are simply avoiding conflict. And when you begin seeing these patterns constantly, something inside you changes. You become quieter, not because you hate people, but because the psychological noise becomes exhausting. Small talk begins to feel repetitive. Surface-level conversations feel predictable. You can already anticipate the response before the person finishes their sentence. Because human behavior is often driven by the same internal forces: fear of rejection, need for validation, desire for status, avoidance of discomfort. This is why many highly observant individuals go through a phase of social withdrawal. Not out of arrogance, not out of superiority, but out of cognitive overload. Your brain is now processing layers of information most people ignore. Tone, body language, microexpressions and contradictions, emotional tension. It is like watching a movie while also seeing the wires, cameras, and stage lights behind the scene. The illusion becomes harder to enjoy. Carl Jung believed that when a person begins seeing through social masks, they often experience a temporary sense of alienation because they realize how much of society operates through personas rather than authenticity. The persona is the mask people wear to function socially, and the more aware you become of it, the harder it becomes to pretend it isn't there. This realization can make you feel strangely alone, not because you have no people around you, but because very few people are operating at the same level of awareness. You may sit in a room full of people and still feel like an observer rather than a participant. But here's the critical thing most people misunderstand. This stage is not the final stage. It is only a transition. Because if you stay here too long, you risk becoming cynical. And cynicism is simply awareness that has lost compassion. Studying people should not lead you to distrust everyone. It should lead you to understand human nature without becoming bitter about it. Because when you understand human psychology, deeply enough, you realize something important. Everyone is struggling with their own unconscious patterns. Everyone is carrying fears they do not understand. Everyone is fighting internal conflicts you cannot see. And once you realize this, your perception changes again. You stop judging people for their unconscious behavior, but you also stop allowing it to control your life. This is where true psychological maturity begins. Not when you see through people, but when you can see through them and still remain calm. Why observers gain invisible power? There's something fascinating that happens when someone begins studying people seriously. Without trying, they start gaining influence. Not loud influence. Not dominance, but something far more powerful. Psychological gravity. Because when you stop reacting impulsively, you become unpredictable, and unpredictability creates power. Most people are extremely easy to read. They react immediately. They defend themselves quickly. They reveal their emotions openly. They explain themselves constantly. But observers behave differently. They pause, they watch, they respond slowly. And this subtle difference changes how others perceive you. Because humans instinctively pay attention to people who appear calm under pressure. Someone who does not rush to react appears mentally stable and emotionally controlled. And emotional control is one of the strongest signals of authority. Think about this carefully. In a heated conversation, the person who reacts first usually loses control. The person who stays calm controls the frame. This is why experienced negotiators, leaders, and strategists rarely respond immediately. They let silence work. They observe reactions. They allow the other person to reveal their intentions. Manipulators hate this type of person because manipulation relies on emotional responses, guilt, fear, anger, urgency. But when someone remains emotionally neutral, those tactics collapse. The manipulator suddenly has nothing to push against, and without emotional leverage, their influence disappears. Observers also gained another advantage. They remember patterns. When someone lies repeatedly, they notice when someone shifts their story. They notice when someone pretends to be someone different around different people. They notice. And because they notice, they rarely trust words alone. They trust behavior over time. This makes them extremely difficult to deceive, because deception requires forgetting, and observers rarely forget patterns. But perhaps the most interesting shift is this. Observers speak less, but when they speak, people listen. Why? Because their words are rare. Most people dilute their words with constant talking. Observers conserve theirs. So when they finally say something, it carries weight. And this is why studying people eventually changes your social presence. You become more selective with attention, more precise with words, more patient with reactions. And this combination creates a strange effect. People begin taking you more seriously, even when you say very little. But the final transformation happens when studying people changes not only how you see others, but how you see yourself. The final stage. Understanding yourself. There is a final realization that comes when someone spends enough time studying human behavior. Eventually, your attention turns inward, because after watching people long enough, you realize something uncomfortable. You are not separate from human nature. You are part of it. You begin noticing your own patterns, your own triggers, your own emotional reactions, your own unconscious motivations. Why did that comment bother you? Why did you seek that approval? Why did you react defensively in that conversation? Carl Jung believed that the deepest psychological journey is not understanding others. It is understanding yourself. He called this process individuation. The process of becoming aware of the unconscious forces shaping your behavior. Because until you see those forces clearly, they control you without your awareness. Studying people reveals these forces everywhere. You see insecurity in others, then you notice it in yourself. You see ego in others, then you recognize your own. You see fear driving someone's behavior, then you realize how often fear drives yours. This realization humbles you, because the observer eventually discovers something profound. Human behavior is not divided into good people and bad people. It is divided into aware people and unaware people. Most people act unconsciously. Driven by fears, they never question. Driven by desires, they never analyze. Driven by emotional patterns formed in childhood, but awareness creates freedom. Because once you see your patterns clearly, you can change them. You can pause, before reacting. You can question your assumptions. You can choose responses instead of repeating automatic behavior. This is the true power of studying people. It is not manipulation. It is not domination. It is clarity. Clarity about others. Clarity about yourself. Clarity about how human nature actually works. And when you reach this stage, something surprising happens. You stop trying to control people. You stop trying to expose everyone. You stop trying to win every interaction. Instead, you focus on living consciously. You choose your relationships carefully. You invest your energy wisely. You walk away from unnecessary conflict. Because the ultimate goal of psychological awareness is not power over others. It is freedom from unconscious behavior. And once you reach that freedom, you move through the world differently. You see more, react less, understand deeper. And in so doing, you become someone very rare. A person who understands human nature without being controlled by it. Why people become uncomfortable around observers. Once you begin studying people deeply, you may start noticing something strange. Some people feel uncomfortable around you, even if you say very little, even if you remain polite, even if you never confront them directly. Your presence alone sometimes creates tension. And the reason is surprisingly simple. Observers disrupt psychological comfort. Most people rely on predictable social reactions. They expect smiles, agreement, emotional validation, quick responses. But when someone becomes highly observant, those reactions slow down. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause, you watch, you think. And that pause changes the dynamic, because silence forces people to sit with their own words. Imagine someone telling a small lie. Normally, they expect quick agreement, or at least a fast response. But when the listener simply watches quietly, the liar suddenly becomes aware of their own story. The silence becomes a mirror, and many people are uncomfortable looking into that mirror. Observers create this mirror effect unintentionally, not because they are trying to intimidate anyone, but because they are no longer reacting automatically. And this reveals something fascinating about human behavior. People feel safest around those who never question the social script. People who laugh on cue, agree on cue, respond emotionally on cue. But observers break that script. And when the script breaks, people become uncertain. You may notice certain reactions. Some people start explaining themselves more than necessary. Some people try to fill the silence with nervous talking. Some people attempt to provoke a reaction from you. They might joke aggressively, tease you, challenge you, because they are trying to regain control of the interaction. This is why quiet observers are sometimes described as intimidating. Not because they are aggressive, but because they are difficult to read. And humans are uncomfortable around people they cannot easily predict. But this reaction also reveals something important. People who are uncomfortable with calm observation are often uncomfortable with self-reflection, because observation naturally exposes contradictions. In behavior, in words, in intentions, and some people prefer never to see those contradictions clearly. However, something else also begins to happen when you develop this level of awareness. Certain people start respecting you more. They may not fully understand why, but they sense emotional stability. They sense self-control. They sense that manipulation will not work easily. And that quiet strength changes how people treat you. But awareness also attracts a different type of attention, because when someone becomes psychologically aware, they often attract the exact people they are trying to understand. Manipulators. Why observers attract manipulators? There is a strange paradox in human psychology. The more perceptive you become, the more you begin encountering manipulative personalities. At first, this feels confusing. Why would manipulators approach someone who can see through them? The answer lies in psychology. Manipulators constantly search for high emotional value targets. People who are empathetic, people who are thoughtful, people who are emotionally intelligent, because those people are capable of providing attention, support, and validation. Highly observant individuals often possess these exact qualities. They listen carefully. They notice emotional signals. They understand complex behavior. And manipulators interpret this as opportunity. But there is an important difference. When observers are inexperienced, they may still fall into manipulation. Because understanding behavior intellectually is not the same as defending against it emotionally. A manipulator may still trigger guilt, sympathy, responsibility, But as awareness deepens, something changes. You begin recognizing the pattern earlier. For example, you notice the person who constantly presents themselves as a victim, but somehow every story paints them as completely innocent. You notice the person who uses intense flattery very early in a relationship. You notice the person who quickly tries to create emotional dependency. These behaviors are not random. They are strategic accelerations of trust. And once you see these patterns repeatedly, they become impossible to ignore. Manipulators depend on speed. Fast emotional bonding. Fast trust. Fast reactions. Observers slow everything down. They take time to evaluate consistency. They compare words with behavior. They observe patterns over months instead of days, and this delay disrupts manipulation completely. Eventually, manipulators sense something different about you. They notice you are not easily provoked. They notice you do not rush to rescue them emotionally. They notice their tactics are not producing the expected results, and most of the time, they quietly lose interest because manipulation requires energy, and manipulators prefer easier targets. But this leads to the final and most important realization of studying human behavior. The ultimate rule of studying human nature. After years of studying people, many observers arrive at the same conclusion. Human nature is incredibly complex, but one principle explains most behavior. People act according to what they believe protects their identity, not necessarily what is true, not necessarily what is fair, but what protects their self-image. This explains many strange behaviors. Why people defend obvious mistakes. Why people deny clear evidence. Why people become angry when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Because admitting the truth would threaten the story they tell themselves about who they are. Understanding this principle changes how you deal with conflict. Instead of trying to prove people wrong, you recognize the psychological threat they feel. Instead of forcing someone to accept reality, you realize that identity defense is stronger than logic. This realization makes you far more strategic. You begin choosing your battles carefully. Some conversations are worth having. Others are not. Some people are capable of reflection. Others are not ready yet. And trying to force awareness on someone who is not ready usually creates resistance. This is why the wisest observers are not constantly correcting others. They are selective. They save their energy. They speak when it matters. And they remain silent when it does not. Because the real goal of studying people is not to control them. It is to understand the world clearly enough that you stop being controlled by unconscious behavior. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop falling into manipulation. You stop chasing approval from people who cannot give it. And slowly, your life becomes simpler. You invest your time in fewer relationships, but those relationships become deeper. You engage in fewer conflicts, but those conflicts become meaningful. You say fewer words, but those words become powerful. And eventually you realize something unexpected. Studying people does not make the world darker. It makes it clearer. You see flaws, but you also see courage. You see manipulation, but you also see kindness. You see insecurity, but you also see growth. Because human nature is not only deception and ego, it is also resilience, curiosity, compassion, and transformation. And when you finally understand this balance, you become someone rare, someone who understands people deeply, but still chooses to believe in the possibility of change. Because the greatest power of psychological awareness is not seeing through people. It is seeing through them, and still choosing wisdom over cynicism.